In general, the engine of a large vehicle is considered to be relatively heavy physical labor, especially a large diesel engine. Today, let's take a look at Tony's plan to repair a 6-cylinder diesel engine on a Hino truck. First of all, let's talk about the situation of this Hino truck engine. It has almost every problem you can imagine that requires major repairs. For example, it lacks power and emits black smoke, burns oil, and has high water temperature. There are also engine noises. So there are multiple issues that require major repairs on the diesel engine. Next, let's take a look at the entire process of overhauling this diesel engine. The first thing that catches the eye is the rusty water passage. I feel like this engine is a dry iron one. But look at the corrosion marks on that water passage. I believe the owner of this vehicle probably adds nothing but well water to the radiator during regular use. Therefore, the corrosion in this water passage is so severe that everything needs to be dismantled. Next, when we open the valve cover, what comes into view is the rocker arm and rocker arm shaft. This diesel engine uses a design where one valve controls each rocker's arm. Nowadays, most engines we see have 4 valves per cylinder, but obviously, this design is a bit outdated. So, there may be a question, is there a big difference between 1 valve and 4 valves per cylinder? The total amount of intake air won't differ much, but the speed of intake and exhaust will be slightly different, so an engine with 4 valves may perform slightly better. Of course, with benefits come drawbacks. You can see the process of removing the rocker arm just now. The structure of the rocker's arm is very simple. It is a lever that controls the opening and closing of a valve. If you design it with 4 valves, you would need an extra set of structures or another piece. So, 1 valve and 4 valves each have their advantages. Now, let's continue to disassemble this engine. Now, we've just removed it. Let's take a look at the condition of the piston and cylinder liner. This detail is not very clear, so we can't judge the wear and tear of the piston and piston ring specifically. What should we do? If we want to repair it properly, it's best to replace the piston rings and see if the cylinder liner needs honing. This is a very long camshaft. This component is used to control the rocker's arm and drive the opening and closing of the valves. I've seen many of these things in Great Wall engines, so I have a question related to engine knowledge. Are all diesel engines in the world controlled by camshafts like this? Of course not. In our daily lives, many diesel engines don't use camshafts. Of course, smaller passenger vehicles with smaller displacements mostly use timing belts. However, when it comes to high-performance diesel engines, most of them have high horsepower, and the benefit is stability. You don't have to worry about a lengthened timing chain, a broken timing belt, or a valve collision. As long as you don't go beyond the limits, which is commonly known as redlining, then there won't be any issues. You mentioned camshafts, of course, there are cases like that. But they are extremely rare. The biggest advantage of using camshafts is stability, but the downside is that they produce a very loud noise, and the sound of the valve train is particularly noticeable. Therefore, in general, diesel engines, especially high-horsepower ones, have a very loud valve train noise. Looking at the wear on this cylinder head, it seems to be quite severe. Just take a reamer or screwdriver and knock on the cylinder head. Maybe I'm seeing this for the first time while operating. The condition of the crankshaft seems to be alright. It shouldn't need any further machining or polishing. However, it is generally not recommended to rework the crankshaft for diesel engines. After polishing the crankshaft, its strength will increase, and it will only be a temporary solution. Therefore, it's better to use standard size bearing shells. If that's not possible, then it's better to get a replacement crankshaft. As you all know, you guys have some skills when it comes to crankshafts. Alright, let's continue with the repair steps. Next, we clean the cylinder block. Diesel can be used for cleaning, although I can't figure out what you used here. The engine block has been thoroughly cleaned, so the cylinder liner should be cleaned as well. If you look closely, the cleanliness after washing is quite good. Based on visual inspection, it seems that the valve seat rings at the valve port don't need to be replaced, and there's no need for a reaming tool either. So, after cleaning it thoroughly and letting it dry, we can directly install it back into the car. Don't rush. Let's move on and take a look at the subsequent installation process. The next step is to install the main and connecting rod bearings. This step doesn't require much technical expertise. Just make sure to correctly position and install the bearings, and tighten them properly, following the standard sequence and torque specifications. Speaking of installing the main and connecting rod bearings, there's a small detail to consider. Sometimes, many experienced mechanics overlook this small detail during the engine overhaul process. It's about the installation orientation of the crankshaft keyway plate. What is the main purpose of the keyway plate? It is inserted into the fixed groove between the crankshaft and the engine block to control the lateral movement of the crankshaft. It ensures that the two small steel rails that limit the crankshaft's lateral swing are properly positioned. During the installation of the keyway plate, many people tend to overlook its specific orientation. It has a strict front and back side, but sometimes people install it incorrectly. Although it may not cause any major issues, if the keyway plate's orientation is reversed, it might lead to some problems. However, let me assure you that the orientation of this keyway plate does make a difference. Let's introduce the specified keyway plate. Take a look. These two small metal pieces are used to securely hold the crankshaft's lateral swing within a certain range. This is their function. Let's see if the mechanic pays attention to the orientation. Oh, indeed, this mechanic glanced at the orientation of the keyway plate. So it seems like they have considerable experience. Now it's time to assemble other small components, which should not pose much difficulty. The scene changes, and we're now on the other side. Next, we will proceed with the installation of some components related to the steel rails. The first thing to install is the valves. Though it may seem like a small and inconspicuous component, it is essential. It seals the valves from the engine oil and combustion, acting as a crucial rubber part. Though it's small in size. If the valve oil seals are in poor condition and the sealing is compromised, what could happen? When the valve oil seals deteriorate, what happens is that when you start the engine, especially in cold weather, for a few seconds, does a large amount of smoke come out of the exhaust pipe? If there is a substantial amount of smoke emitted within 2 to 3 seconds, it's a clear sign that your valve oil seals have aged. In low temperatures, the elasticity of the seals decreases. When the vehicle is parked for a long time, as we know, the valves are facing downwards, with the valves on top and the intake ports below. In this case, the engine oil flows directly into the combustion chamber through the valve. So, in the morning, when you start your vehicle, if a significant amount of oil is burnt instantly, it's likely due to worn valve oil seals. Once the temperature rises, the rubber's elasticity improves, and the oil consumption decreases. Alright, let's get back to the video. Now, these awkward little components have been installed. The next step is to install the exhaust pipe, and this engine is getting closer to completion. As expected, the next step would be, as I mentioned earlier, the installation of pistons and connecting rods, followed by the oil pan. Then, we have the oil pump and some external sealing components. After that, we can install the distributor and test the engine to see how this Chevrolet machine performs. However, there's a saying, and I want to emphasize that although we admire everything else that the mechanic has done, their skills in overhauling engines are quite average, to be honest. That's how it is, with no other implications. Let's continue watching the video. So, now that the external small components have been reinstalled, it's time to put the diesel pump back in place and align the vehicle badge properly. Then, we can proceed to the next step. Installation is completed. It can install pistons and connecting rods. Then the steel rail is pressed on. Next, the valve handle is fastened. This engine can now be tested. This is the shell of Daewoo. What is this position for? This position is where the sealing strip is applied after grasping. However, the way Batie uses this glue is only average. It shouldn't be applied excessively, as that would have a counterproductive effect. Apply an appropriate amount. Next, install the cannon shell. Then return the recovered oil. The installation area has exceeded the specified amount. There are many opinions about this process. Some people can complete the installation of the retrieval like a breeze, and they can start wandering in as little as 2 months. The same amount of oil is used for installation by some experienced technicians, and it may not leak for several years. This is a very small detail. How do you We won't discuss it here, as it is too complicated. Please continue reading. Of course, it's not like Batie Brothers who directly position it with a hammer. That's not how retrieval works. Alright, let's continue with the installation of these external accessories for the engine. This process is not very difficult. Next, let's take a look at how to install the piston. There is a certain level of technical expertise required to install the connecting rod for the piston. I don't know if any of you have heard of a TRM called Dunk King. Some of the mechanical repair friends must know the high price. When we talk about dunking, we understand that it means disassembling. However, diesel engines generally do not require an electric grid. The operation of the electric grid is only used on gasoline engines. That's not the case. Some experienced technicians maintain diesel engines using this electric grid method. I witnessed it when my mentor was repairing a diesel engine. He thought that the clearance of this connecting rod bearing was not particularly perfect, so he placed a very thin sheet of aluminum foil there. The resulting machine has a nice sound. Is it necessary to rely on dunking? It's not easy to say on diesel engines. I don't know if any expert mechanics among you can provide some details. Also, when installing new pistons and connecting rods, some technicians will weigh the entire assembly on a scale. Even a few grams of difference would require some adjustments to achieve uniformity. Does this technique vary from person to person in the field of repair? Let's talk about this. Let's just consider it as a small story and a minor detail. All the pistons have been installed and the piston pin and connecting rod have been secured. Next, it's time to insert the pistons. There is no major technical difficulty in inserting the piston into the cylinder. The only thing to note is not to align it incorrectly. If it's misaligned, it's not just a simple oil burn, there is a possibility of black smoke and loss of power. So, it's important to avoid misalignment. Pay attention to this detail, insert all the pistons according to the crankshaft rotation position, and then you can install the 2 rings. I haven't relied on torque wrenches for this, so the repair is still in line with what was mentioned earlier. There is no other meaning. Alright. After the piston installation is complete, the next step is to install the upper part of the engine, starting with the diesel pump, followed by the cylinder head, and then the previously mentioned oil and water pipelines. After that, you can start the test drive. However, during the process of installation and power supply installation, some small details need to be noted. That is the strict order of tightening the screws. Not all screws can immediately hold the power without leaking air or water. Initially, everyone thought the same way. But later the master told everyone that the screws have a specific direction and order. First, tighten the 2 in the middle, and then proceed diagonally from side to side in sequence. I'm not sure if this method is standard. But it leans toward that direction instead of the current common practice. It seems that there are no significant issues with it. There is another thing. If you think this cylinder is prone to power supply leaks, what should you do? There is a very simple method. Apply a thin layer of grease to both sides of the gasket on this cylinder mattress, and then proceed with the installation. Under the effect of high temperature, the grease will solidify and harden, providing a very effective sealing function. Another method is to use optical adhesive. There is also another method, which is to use self-spray paint. Apply a thick layer of the optical adhesive to both sides and hold it while it is still wet. This will provide a good sealing effect. Look, these 3 screws are simply tightened with 2 large straw stalks. And the torque wrench is also used. Anyway, this is how the repair process goes. Next is the installation of the rocker's arm and the installation of the valve demonstration. Then, it can be lifted and placed on the vehicle for takeover. Let's skip this small process. The valve can be adjusted to the small valve. We don't need to talk about that technique. Most people can handle the barcode, and it only takes 30 to jump. Let's skip this process and see what the effect is after driving. There is a very interesting detail. After the installation of the engine lifting is completed, the 2 buddies here are preparing for a sincere prayer before the test run. This directly caught the attention of the audience. Is there any chance that they are afraid that the engine won't start after it's installed? They opened it from this turbocharged laser in Russia. They checked it, and there is no problem with the fuel supply, but the sound seems a bit strange. We want to know what you think about this sound. If the lazy bear stops and listens to the sound of this engine, it feels like it should be checked. Alright, this video segment ends here. See you in the next episode.